Dude, you are gonna be shocked when you find out how much of what you thought you knew about werewolves actually comes from the movies and not, you know, like actual folklore. I know I was. I knew about some of this stuff going in, but, well, you'll see what I mean. The full moon, silver bullets, none of that's real. But before we get started, make sure that you hit that subscribe button so you can join me next time. I like breaking down mythical beasts and monsters, maybe because I am one myself. And my next video is going to be a breakdown on the history of Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
She alone will stand against the vampires, the demons, and the forces of darkness. She is the Slayer.
So trust me when I say that you aren't going to want to miss that. Now, let's talk about that Lon Chaney Jr. movie, the one that kind of started it all. It wasn't the first werewolf movie, not by a long shot. That would be the 1913 silent film The Werewolf, directed by Henry McCrae, about a Navajo woman who uses witchcraft to become a timber wolf in order to get revenge against white settlers. It wasn't super popular at the time. Critics kind of saw it as being gore for gore's sake, and every copy of The Werewolf wound up being destroyed in a fire at Universal Studios in 1924. But this idea that you can become a werewolf using some form of witchcraft was actually way more popular back in the day than you would think. It even appears in the first werewolf story ever recorded, which is also the oldest known story in the Western world, the Epic of Gilgamesh. At one point in the story, Gilgamesh turns down a girl because he finds out that she turned her ex into a wolf. Are you kidding me? That sounds like a turn on to me. I'm okay with being turned into a wolf, spending my days running around the woods with all my friends, yes please. But between the 15th to 18th centuries, turning someone into a wolf using magic was something you really didn't want to be doing. You're probably already familiar with the whole concept of witch hunts, right? Well, did you know that it was, well, not uncommon for witch hunts to lead into actual werewolf hunts? Take poor 18-year-old Hans the werewolf for an example, who in 1651 was brought before the court in what is now northern Estonia on charges of being a werewolf. Hans confessed right away, saying that he'd been hunting in the body of a wolf for the past 2 years. Hunting animals, just to make that clear. Hans claimed that he'd been given the body of a wolf by some mysterious man in black, who the court immediately took to be the devil. Hans was asked if he'd been turned into a wolf through full bodily transformation, or if he believed that his spirit was being transferred to the body of a wolf while he was hunting. Hans pointed to a dog bite he had on his leg and said that he only could have gotten that while he was in wolf form, so full bodily transformation it was. Now, it's important to keep in mind just how young Hans was during all of this, plus he would have been under an immense amount of pressure to confess, and that isn't even to mention the role that mental illness might have played. It is a real tragedy that Hans was sentenced to death over this. Turning into a wolf was pretty popular in Northern Europe, where wolves are everywhere, and Christians tend to associate them with the devil. But other cultures have their own stories of people using magic to turn into some sort of predatory animal. If you go to Africa, you may even hear legends of the were-hyena, like Somalia's Kori Ismaris, who is believed to turn himself into a hyena by night by rubbing himself with a magic stick. Movies also like to say that Native Americans believe in their own version of werewolves, but we'll get into that in a little bit. For now, we're getting a little off track. Where were we again? Oh, yes, werewolves and witchcraft. We talked about the two as if there was some sort of connection for centuries. So what changed? Where did we get this idea that you become a werewolf by a werewolf's bite? Well, that one was pretty much made up by the writers at Universal Pictures.
It even comes up in their 1935 movie Werewolf of London, which came out 6 years before the Wolfman used the trope. But the Wolfman was so much bigger than any werewolf movie Universal had tried to make before, and when it dropped in 1941, even the trailer straight up tells us,
"Whoever is bitten by a werewolf and lives becomes a werewolf himself."
You didn't even have to see the movie to hear that.
Plus, people just really didn't know a whole lot about werewolves when the Wolfman came out. Sure, they'd been around in folklore for centuries, but that was all just stuff and nonsense. Not something that reasonable people believed in. Or at the very least, if they did, they didn't talk about it for fear of being labeled crazy.
Hell, you can even tell that werewolves were kind of new to movie audiences from Henry Talbot's reaction when he first hears about them.
Werewolf? What's that?
Who needs to ask that nowadays? This scene has Talbot introducing himself to shop girl Gwen, who he's been spying on from across the street, but she's so not interested in him.
How about the little dog? That would suit you.
This movie's great for the way it makes use of that theme of the beast within mankind. Jewish screenwriter Kurt Sielmak was heavily influenced by the fact that he'd had to flee from Germany before coming to this screenplay. As he put it, I am the Wolf Man. I was forced into a fate that I didn't want, to be a in Germany. I would not have chosen that as my fate. And then you have the way that the Romani are completely dehumanized in this movie. Talbot literally kills Bela Lugosi's character like a dog, and he spends the next portion of the movie trying to convince everyone that he's killed an animal, despite being confronted with the reality that his victim was a human being. In some sense, this movie feels like it inspired later horror movies like Drag Me to Hell, another story about someone being magically punished after they do something that contributes to our society's centuries-long injustices against the Romani.
I beg you, and you shame me.
Except there, the Romani were made out to look like evil witches who are actively trying to attack any innocent person who just bumbles their way into a situation way over their head.
Mrs. Ganesh.
1941's The Wolf Man makes you feel like Bela Lugosi's character was just another poor soul like Henry Talbot. And Talbot's punishment for killing him is to be hunted the way Bela Lugosi was all his life. And on top of that, Talbot's also being forced to show who he truly is, right on his face.
How about the little dog? That would suit you.
The werewolf look in this movie is mostly made up using yak fur and a rubber snout. Lon Chaney Jr. hated having to sit for 5 to 6 hours for makeup.
Which, as someone who used to have hair down past my butt, I kinda get. Lon Chaney Jr. would even try to say that makeup artist Jack Pierce was actively trying to burn him with the curling iron. Which, again, I've been there. I doubt that Jack Pierce was trying to burn him, but, you know, the whole world's against you when you've been sitting for that long. They're all trying to pull your hair, when in reality they're just brushing it.
Still, that didn't stop Chaney from calling Jack years later the greatest goddamn sadist in the world.
It's not a compliment, I guess.
Another thing you may find interesting about the werewolves in this movie is that they don't need the full moon to transform. They can just do it any old night. That bit of werewolf lore wouldn't become canon until 1943. When the sequel to The Wolf Man changed the words to the first movie's poem. In The Wolf Man, Gwen recites a poem she claims comes from old legend, but is actually an invention of the movie.
Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night
But it includes the line,
may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright.
That same poem was used in the opening to Frankenstein Meets the Wolf Man.
Even a man who's pure at heart and says his prayers by night
But it's a little different.
may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the moon is full and bright.
From that moment on, we've all been associating werewolves with the full moon. 1941's The Wolf Man did invent the idea of silver bullets, however. There is this old Swedish legend that says that silver bullets can be used against any monster that's resistant to regular guns. And silver as a pure metal has been used to deter monsters for centuries. But the people who were actually killed for being werewolves would usually be burned at the stake or hanged, and from what I understand, that usually did the trick. Trust me, I wish that those stories ended with the accused finding out that they could only be harmed with silver bullets and running off into the woods to live free from humans, but no, history is usually a lot suckier than that.
And finally, one last piece of werewolf lore this movie tries to put forth is the idea that the pentagram is the symbol of the werewolf. You may have heard this come up in movies before, but your mind probably doesn't go right away to werewolves when you see someone wearing a pentagram in the street.
The pentagram has an extremely long history that would probably take a whole video itself to explain, but Cliff Notes version, it's a symbol of protection and religious devotion that's been around since around 3500 BCE. In the 19th century, it was taken up by occultists and would later be adopted by Wiccans and Satanists, which is probably the reason why it appears in The Wolf Man. I do hold the pentagram sacred. I even have one tattooed right on me because I wanted its protection in my skin. But when I wear a pentagram for protection, I'm thinking more that it's going to protect me from certain energies, you know? Like, if nothing else, if I'm feeling a little stressed stressed that day, I can always just look down at my arm and remember that the world is a beautiful place that's a lot bigger than me and my petty problems. And that at least gets me by, you know? I'm not really thinking it's gonna keep me protected from, you know, werewolves, although that would be a cool bonus.
The pentagram thing also comes up in the 1981 An American Werewolf in London, which obviously gets its title from A Werewolf in London, even though the two movies have very little to do with each other. But what's this one about? Our main characters are two young Americans backpacking through Europe, starting off in England, where they're miserable and cold right away. The original A Werewolf in London made England feel like home, and our main character in that movie gets bitten by a werewolf while traveling through Tibet.
I don't know, I just find it interesting that An American Werewolf in London depicts England as this miserable, old-fashioned place where things like werewolves are just known about. Well, the movie it gets its name from makes it look like werewolves just don't happen in modern England. That's a thing that happens in other countries, but when it does come to England, it's terrifying. It's just two different takes is all I mean, and both of them from American filmmakers.
But back to our backpackers for a bit. They stop at a bar that has a pentagram painted on the wall, but the locals don't like them asking questions, so they kick them out, fully knowing that there's a werewolf wandering the moors. One of the Americans is torn apart, but the other one, David, gets away with just a few scars. He starts having violent dreams and receiving visits from his dead friend telling him that he's a werewolf now, and that the only way he can free the souls of those who have been touched by the curse, including his friend and later the people who David kills, is for David to end the curse by ending his own life. David's entire situation can be compared to survivor's guilt. He feels like he didn't deserve to get away when his best friend didn't, and not confronting those feelings isn't helping him. David's nightmares do a great job of building on this movie's theme of the beast within humanity, especially when you see the zombie soldiers attack a peaceful American family who are just trying to watch the Muppets.
It's good. It's a good aggressive behavior.
Moments like this probably played a huge part in inspiring movies like 2002's Dog Soldiers, which dives even deeper into the idea that war turns good men into beasts. But going back to David for a minute here, the fact that he's having such vivid nightmares feels very realistic to the experience of living with PTSD. The special effects in this movie are unlike anything you've ever seen in any other werewolf movie. It's amazing they managed to do all this using only practical effects. Makeup artist Rick Baker and his team made multiple versions of David's head and limbs to be switched out at different stages of his transformation, making it look like his body was growing longer. It took them about a week to film this one scene, and that isn't even to mention all the effort Baker put into things like making David's friend look like he's been rotting more and more with every visit. You will never be able to convince me that CGI is better than practical effects. I'm sorry. I know CGI has its place. Movies like Avatar couldn't exist if we didn't have it, but when artists like Rick Baker exist, we should really be giving more jobs to them.
Rick Baker's kind of the guy when it comes to werewolf transformations.
He won the Academy Award for Best Makeup because of this movie, and he went on to do the makeup in 1994's Wolf and the 2010 movie The Wolf Man. He was even supposed to work with famous horror director Wes Craven on his 2005 movie Cursed, but that one is a bit of a famous flop.
The movie was like almost finished when all of a sudden Bob Weinstein came in demanding all of these changes, including that the movie be brought down from an R rating to PG-13, meaning reshoots, plot changes, and Rick Baker's practical effects being replaced with bad CGI.
There are moments of goodness that managed to shine through all the suck, which was obviously going to happen when you have both Wes Craven and Christina Ricci here. She gets bitten by a werewolf along with her brother, Jesse Eisenberg, and the two of them have to figure out who the head werewolf is so they can kill him and reverse their transformation before it's too late. So it's the Lost Boys without the 80s fashion, the killer soundtrack, or a strong script. Outside of our heroes, we also get two other werewolves this time, and it is kind of cool that being a werewolf means something different to each of them. Jesse Eisenberg's character is obviously meant to be a metaphor for puberty, and coming into himself a bit more to impress the girl he likes. For Christina Ricci, she's transforming into a werewolf at the same time as she's starting to feel sexual urges for the first time since the traumatic death of her parents. appearance.
And no spoilers, but for one of our villains, she uses her predatory form to take out any woman she views as competition, while our other villain is a good old-fashioned wolf, in that he's a man-whore kind of way.
But going back to the idea of werewolves as a metaphor for puberty, Kirst clearly owes a lot to the 1985 comedy Teen Wolf, which is sort of the ultimate werewolves as a metaphor for puberty movie. He's growing hair in new places, feeling certain urges for the first time, all that good stuff. The movie is actually pretty lighthearted, but if you wanted this idea in more of a teen drama style along the same vein of something like Riverdale, maybe consider checking out the 2011 spin-off series by MTV.
If you were to ask me what my favorite puberty werewolf movie is though, or my favorite werewolf movie period if I'm being honest,
I would have to go with the 2000 Canadian horror movie Ginger Snaps. This movie shaped me when I was a teenager.
Wrists are for girls. I'm slitting my throat.
Ginger and Bridget are sisters who stage pictures of their own deaths for fun. They also stick out in other ways too. Bridget starts out pretty soft-spoken, whereas Ginger is looked at as the hot one, but she has no interest in boys whatsoever.
I think we should get together. Oh.
One night, the sisters sneak out, but Ginger winds up getting her period, and the smell of her blood attracts a werewolf. She's attacked, and Bridget manages to pull her away to safety, but it doesn't take long for them to figure out that Ginger is now turning into a werewolf. Bridget spends the rest of the movie obsessed with finding a cure for her sister when she really doesn't want it. Ginger's actually pretty happy being a werewolf.
Goddamn force of nature.
She tries sex for the first time and finds that that's actually pretty boring.
There's just all this squirming, and then he's done. And you're like, oh.
But what she does enjoy is having the power to rip boys to shreds if they bother her.
Can I touch your boobies? Like little girls. He hasn't done anything! I don't like how he looks at you.
I won't spoil the ending on this one because if you haven't seen it yet, you need to. Ginger Snaps is one of those rare perfect movies, and it has the most brutally honest portrayal of puberty I've ever seen. There's always a certain level of violence involved in adolescence, whether it's literal in the sense of acting out the way Ginger does, or it's metaphorical, as in having to kill off the childish version of yourself even when there are parts of that self you would rather hold on to. In either case, Ginger Snaps takes not only girls, but teenagers far more seriously than a lot of media out there, and it will always have a special place in my heart because of that.
But while we're on the topic of werewolves written for teenagers, we gotta talk about the shirtless werewolf in the room.
There's a reason to view werewolves as a sort of macho fantasy like they do in Twilight. They're strong, hairy, base instinct creatures that can't seem to keep their clothes on.
I'm more into feminine people personally, and even I get it.
But Twilight takes that lore to a weird place by making werewolves members of the Quaalude tribe who developed shapeshifting abilities as a natural defense against invading vampires in the area.
The Quaalude tribe is a real tribe, by the way, and no, their people aren't werewolves. In fact, they've spoken quite openly about how Twilight has harmed their public image more than anything. And obviously it's super racist, but this idea of Native Americans either being werewolves or believing in werewolves isn't necessarily coming from nothing here. I already mentioned the 1913 movie about a Navajo woman becoming a werewolf on purpose in order to get revenge against white settlers. A story that bears a striking similarity to the werewolves in Twilight defending themselves against invading vampires.
But then again, in 1981, we also got the crime thriller Wolfen, which makes it seem as though Native Americans all believe in this race of all-powerful wolf gods with the ability to possess people and turn them into werewolves, and that Native American communities see this possession as a good thing.
This isn't even close to a real Native American legend, although Wolfen was probably inspired by the Navajo legend of the Skinwalker. It's believed that to speak of the Skinwalker gives it more power, which unfortunately I'm gonna have to do for the sake of this video. But don't go like grilling your local Navajo person about this or anything, okay? It's actually become a bit of a problem with the growing popularity of this legend on the internet, and especially with writers like J.K. Rowling not fully doing their research before bringing this monster out into popular culture. But anyway, skinwalkers are not werewolves in the way that we tend to think about them. According to Navajo belief, skinwalkers are harmful witches with the ability to turn themselves into any animal, not just wolves. White people just like to focus on the whole wolf thing because we got really fixated on this one idea and we're sticking with it, you guys.
The 1996 movie Werewolf may be the kind of quality that it got featured on Mystery Science Theater 3000.
I held his paw and I touched his cold nose. That means he's healthy!
But it's worth bringing up because it goes out of its way to refer to skinwalkers by name.
Skinwalker.
Before going on to use movie werewolf logic for the entire rest of its runtime. Full moons, being turned into a werewolf by bites, all that.
So I think we can at least give Stephenie Meyer the grace of recognizing that she didn't invent this idea. It's an idea that's been bopping around in American culture for years now. She just helped us realize how shady it was that we keep doing this. Our media likes to tell us that werewolves come from folklore and that folklore is pretty much universal. But it's rare that you see a werewolf movie nowadays that ignores the rule of silver bullets and full moons, even though none of that has any basis in anyone's folklore. But there is one last piece of werewolf lore I wanted to talk about before we go. What about the idea that werewolves hate vampires? Where did that come from?
We've seen it in Twilight, and even What We Do in the Shadows uses their rivalry as a running joke.
Chase this bundle of sticks. Werewolves?
No, it's not real.
It's not real.
Well, that one's actually a fairly recent addition.
It was made popular by the Underworld series, which gave us this huge multi-generational war between vampires and werewolves. But that isn't to say that Underworld got the idea from nowhere either.
It wasn't like an established thing that werewolves hate vampires before the early 2000s.
But 1948's Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein did give us this big epic battle between Dracula and the Wolf Man that probably played a part in setting this rivalry between the races up. Talbot makes it pretty clear that he hates Dracula in this movie too, which makes a lot of sense when you consider everything about who they are. Talbot is the monster who can't hide because he has no control over his condition. He had to abandon his life and family to live as a hunted monster full-time because of a condition that lasts one night a month. The rest of the time, he's human and capable of feeling bad about his state in life. On the other hand, Dracula is pretty much in full-time predator mode and has absolutely zero moral problems with that, mostly because he's able to pass for human and live in a castle with his 3 wives.
It's like cats and dogs meeting, really. So it makes a lot of sense for Talbot and Dracula to fight, sure, and I guess every other werewolf and vampire just decided to follow along. Weird, but I think I've picked a fight over less. What's your favorite werewolf story? It can be a book, movie, episode of a TV show, anything. If I find something new that interests me, I might do a shorter spin-off video later, and you can be a huge help for me in that. Thank you so much for joining me here today, my friends, and after all this bad press against wolves, who really are just animals and not mindless monsters who eat people like sharks do when they're in a Sharknado, I feel like it's important for us to remember. You have less to fear from wolves than you do from the humans who have historically endangered them. Take us away, Farney.
And animals never had a war. Who's the real animals?
Special thanks to my supporters on Patreon, Ericobia, Arietta Crafty Bryant, Justin East, and Wilson L. Ricks III. If you'd like to become a part of our little monster squad, just know that everybody's welcome. Hitting that subscribe button is a surefire way to become a member, but the Patreon link is there in the video description if you'd like to receive some bonus perks along the way. Things like early access to videos and scripts, and your name called out at the end. Until next time, my friends.